World building. It's a word I've said about 1,000,000 times on this channel because throughout the few dozen videos I've made on the subject, there is just a lot to say about it. You can create worlds of incredible depth and intrigue that force us to grapple with the reality of our own existence. And then sometimes world building looks like this. Today, we're going to be doing something a little different from usual. This will be more conversational. And that's because we're going to be talking about the concept of lazy world building. That glorious image you just saw was sent to me by my girlfriend this past week as it's part of a post making fun of lazy world building, and it got me thinking, what does that phrase even really mean? We can look at this image and say, yes, this is lazy world building, but what about it specifically is lazy, and what parts of that laziness affect its quality negatively? It's kind of intuitively obvious at the outset, but I think there's a lot that we can learn by just sort of talking about it and all of the different ways in which its laziness impact it, and all of the different facets of what makes certain world building good versus bad. So I think we'll start from a bird's eye view. The first thing to talk about right off the bat is basically the idea of having Goodguyland, Badguyland, and for lack of a better term, not important guy that still needs to be there so you think we tried land. This trope is burned so deeply into the DNA of fantasy as a genre in particular that it's almost taken for granted in some circles, and pretty much every single fantasy world has something that at least a little bit resembles this. Most notably in that even if there isn't a strictly good guy land, there is an evil land in most settings. The simple, easy reason for that is because the entire fantasy genre still stands on Tolkien's shoulders, and Tolkien had Mordor. Even going further back, if we don't want to rely on just him as the reason for this showing up so often, one could simply point at the countless folk tales that speak of dark and evil lands, you know, evil forests and all that sort of deal. The idea of places of evil is pretty much inherent to fantastical storytelling in some way or another. So I think it's fairly safe to say that having a bad guy land isn't an inherently bad thing. But obviously the devil is in the details, especially with the depiction that we have going on here. Really, the problem becomes more pronounced with our actually having of a good guy. Good kingdoms of good people are almost as inherently a trope in storytelling as is having a land of evil. But obviously, when it's stated so explicitly that one specific place is the protagonist zone, it does start to give off whiffs of only the things that directly surround the protagonist are important syndrome. And while that's obviously always kind of true on a meta-narrative level, it's not good for immersion and thus still makes a story worse. The protagonist's bubble should be more important than things outside of it because that's what the story demands to be the case, not because that's fundamentally the way that the world that that character lives in works. For example, Tatooine in Star Wars is more important narratively speaking than, say, Corellia, even though the latter is where they make all the warships. However, this is because the audience sees Tatooine through the eyes of Luke and Anakin and doesn't see Corellia. Not because Corellia is fundamentally unimportant to the setting, it's just the idea that you want the audience to believe important things happen in the world, even while the protagonist is active elsewhere, and that basically summarizes the problems of having good guy especially if it doesn't consist of everything in the world that isn't bad guy A better dichotomy to describe well-crafted fantasy worlds is that they might have a bad guy land, but they don't also have an opposing good guy land so much as they have a lot of other not bad guy lands. Anyway, before these various land phrases melt our brains, we can move slightly deeper onto bad geography, and we're actually given two different kinds of bad geography in this image. The more I look at it, the more I'm convinced the original poster of it actually put quite a lot of thought into this little experiment, or at least accidentally hit on a lot of important tropes. Either way, bad geography. Now, realistically, there are 3 types of bad geography, but we'll hit on the 2 that are actually present in the image first. So one thing we've got here is bloblands, as we can see in Antagnia and Neutralia. This is quite common as being a baseline interpretation of what continents look like. Since continents are uneven and asymmetrical, we often see fantasy continents that look like someone threw a bucket of paint onto a wall. They tend to be uneven and almost unnatural looking, but not in the ways that continents actually appear such. They tend to lack specific features. There might be mountains somewhere, or, something along those lines, but they never really have distinct biomes or actual features in them, or what I really could just call personality. I mean, look at the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. It has a really interesting shape to it, doesn't it? I bet you could show this to a novice fantasy mapmaker and ask if it was realistic, and they would say,
No, it's too inconsistent in its shape. Nothing looks like this. Unrealistic.
My point is just that continents are weird. I'm not saying you have to really care about learning about fault lines or the way that continents form, as plenty of great fantasy universes and maps of them have been made without that knowledge, but don't be afraid to do things that look like Sulawesi. The world is weird looking. Italy looks like a boot. Iberia is literally just a square, and Sri Lanka's teardrop shape makes it look like India is crying. Don't be afraid to go a little out there because those weird shapes make the world interesting. But that's just one kind of bad geography. Another kind is the copy their homework but change a few words around approach. Because what I mean by saying the world is weird takes some of that energy does not translate to just make Italy upside down. Nobody will notice. Because they will notice. As we can see with Protagnia, it's just a really bad copy of Western, Southern, and Central Europe. Poor Denmark. Daneland. They're just a little spike. And the Bulgarians are just called Berga. Maybe it's part American. There doesn't end up being all that much to say about this. If you copy real continents too much, people will notice and lose immersion. However, I lied. There is something to say about this, and I saw it in the comments of the post that we're talking about. Raiders in the icy north were mentioned as an expectation to be added to this world, as are comments about a generic eastern land that's basically China, etc., etc. But that hints at an entire topic that we're going to hit on at the end of the video. Anyway, the third type of bad world building not portrayed here is when one commits to fantastical continent shapes and doesn't do very well at that. In this case, that'll most often mean they're bad in the sense of being tonally inconsistent. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have fantastical, ridiculous-looking continents, but your story needs to fit that. Pull a Terry Pratchett, put your world on a world turtle, that's fine, but make sure that the universe and its vibe matches that energy. You're not writing Grimdark on a world turtle, alright? And while an incredibly complex and realistic map isn't ever going to really be bad, it's definitely going to be out of place if you're writing pulpy, simple, kid-friendly kind of fantasy. Point being, if you're going to make a silly world, commit and give it a reason. Maybe take that example of throwing paint at a wall and say the gods threw land at an ocean. I don't care. So with that covered, we've been doing some analyzing now and might notice that only Protagnia has provincial distinctions. Neutralia and Antagnia are just one big blob of irrelevant and evil, respectively. There are, however, important distinctions to be made on this topic. The first is that the general concept that the main place your protagonist is from is going to be more developed than other places. That whole idea is not really a problem. Nobody should hold you at gunpoint and force you to create every detail of your world's equivalent to Tristan de Dunha just because it's technically there. Naturally, the places the plot centers on deserve more narrative attention. However, the problem comes when the plot moves to other places and they don't keep up. Say that the plot of whatever story starts in Protagnia takes our characters to Neutralia. I don't have a good feeling that there'd be anything particularly complex or interesting about Neutralia because it's made clear from the outset that no effort was spent developing it. The same can happen in an even worse way if the plot moves to Antagnia, where that being the land of evil, it should be more important, and yet the whole thing still ends up being some empty, identical wasteland filled with one type of evil creature that all unwaveringly serve a dark lord. It just isn't interesting. And this, despite what you might immediately jump to, isn't Tolkien's fault. He had the Easterlings, Mordor, Isengard, and plenty more. Just because an undiscerning viewer might sort all of them into bad guys doesn't mean that there wasn't any complexity to their design or background. So, unequal lore development, which I guess we'll call this phenomenon, does become a problem when it affects locations that are going to be interacted with in the story. Beyond that, however, we'll start to dip our toes into what I consider the most important point of this video, with the next problem being bad names. Now, in fantasy, the names of things can be bad for so many reasons, and that, of course, is because language is hard, especially when you're dealing with the implied construction of up to dozens of languages that don't even exist. The disclaimer that I want to make here is that every fantasy name, even 100% of Tolkien's, are going to be called stupid and bad by somebody out there because that's just the nature of the genre. Native English speakers can barely pronounce English names themselves half the time, much less names from other languages, much less names from other made-up languages. So to an extent, you kind of have to be content with names some people will just hate and or mispronounce. So while I'll be referring to everything I'm about to say as bad, keep that disclaimer in mind. With that out of the way, the first kind of bad fantasy names are ones that are just unsubtly adjusted, real, usually English words. Now, as with most of these, it's not that that very method is the problem, it's the doing it badly part, but let me explain. I mean, what's there to say about it in regards to the example we've got here? Protagnia, Antagnia, Neutralia, like, we know what's going on here. When applied to characters, these kinds of names turn into things like Dark Shadow, Nightshade, or Heroic, Von Goodnice. However, this trope does have a use if you actually, put thought into it. You can adapt real words into fantasy names, and when it's done right, the audience should not notice that that's the case, but they might still have a little inclination as to what something sounds like. And that's that golden zone you want to be in. An example that I tried to do in my own universe is that I have a character in my universe whose last name, especially pronounced correctly, is Chavilov, which is a real name, but I chose it because to an English speaker, because those will be my main audience, the way they'd read it, it sounds like Kavelov, which brings to mind the word cavalier, which describes the character this name belongs to. It's, hopefully, subtle enough that most people won't realize or think about that at all, and that's a good middle ground, I think. The next kind of bad fantasy name tends to be the unpronounceable. This is another major caveat, which you already know from my disclaimer, because unpronounceable doesn't really mean anything, considering I've heard people call even people like Aragorn, Aragon, or Hermione, Hermione. So, this doesn't really matter unless you overdo it badly. Example, Thrinvigshafarin Phlegmacarnagoth is probably not a good name to give to your protagonist because you'll be having to write that down and read it to yourself consistently. I'm not even sure that I just said it right. There's also the tragedy phenomenon, which I didn't expect I'd find any reason to bring up in a video, but here we are. Have you ever seen this image? It's basically this, where you take what's often a standard American name or standard syllables you're used to hearing, and then just change letters around because they don't mean anything, and end up with something that sounds terrible. But it's fantastical. The final surefire way of getting a bad fantasy name is taking real names from real languages you don't know and then adapting them in ways that native speakers of that language will find strange. I actually think adapting real names to fantasy settings, when done right, is one of the better ways to get good names, especially if they're antiquated names people don't really use anymore. But just make sure you aren't giving your king a name that's that language's equivalent to Bob, or they'll rightfully point and laugh at you. However, the last big thing in this whole video, and kind of the reason that I actually made it, is the general concept I saw a little bit in the original image, but definitely got some of in the video's comments and just kind of around in general, is the vibe that pulling your world building from real history is lazy and bad, and if you don't develop every single culture from the exact ground up, from zero, from scratch, based on nothing, you're basically a failure and a hack. I'm obviously exaggerating, but I see this opinion quite a lot, and the way I see it, it's a train of thought that actively makes the fantasy genre worse. Fantasy is not the rejection of our real histories and cultures, it's in part a celebration of them. Much of what Tolkien did consolidated all sorts of religious, mythological, and folkloric ideas about the way that the people of the past saw the world and added magic to that world. And in the incredible success of Tolkien and the fantasy genre, some of that magic has in a way come back into our modern world. Why else do you think people are so eager to tell stories about pointy-eared people after an 8-hour shift in a cubicle? The way I see it, you can't really develop fantasy worlds from nothing the way that this idea suggests that you should do. All of the residual cultural knowledge we have comes from the real histories of people of the past, and that is the clay that we shape our worlds from. There's not a lot of other material, and you can't conjure that clay from nothing. What you can do is shape it in ways that nobody's thought about before, and that's what you should aim for. None of this should really be a surprise for many of you who've watched me before as an outspoken fan of Warhammer Fantasy, but that world pulls almost blatantly from history at times. I mean, the guy who discovered that world's new world was literally named Lost Erickson, as in Leif Erikson got lost. And yet, it still has better world building than 99% of the worlds I hear about that are totally original, because it put some effort into putting a spin on real history, and even when it stuck really close to it, it at least had a satirical spin on it to be funny. Because just calling a guy Lost Erickson is pretty funny. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to do new things when you're developing your worlds. I'm saying the exact opposite of that. Iterate on what we already have and give us new perspectives. Mix things together in new ways. Pull things from cultures that we haven't seen in the fantasy genre. Tolkien mostly pulled from medieval Britain. There's a whole rest of the world that fantasy can come from. Then, obviously, when bringing in things from real culture, make sure to do it authentically, at least to the best of your abilities. That isn't to say just copy real history and real culture, but put a genuine effort into applying it. Don't make your fantasy Japan be made up of 100% carbon copy samurai. Actually try and develop it into a unique and faithful interpretation of the things you find interesting about Japanese culture. This can work really well. But you aren't going to get anywhere trying to make pottery without that cultural clay. Here's where I say that it isn't actually the post that I've been talking about this whole video that made me pull the trigger on making this video, but it's actually because of a wonderful video, a fellow small YouTuber, and that's a very relative term. He's still like 10 times larger than me. But he's called The Bordeaux Show, and he made a video last year about guns and fantasy. And aside from all the other great points he made during that video, and I think you should go watch it, he said that one of the biggest problems with the modern pop fantasy genre is that it has basically become an Ouroboros. Fantasy iterating on fantasy, a snake eating its own tail until it loses its own distinct identity and essentially loses its quality. Tolkien worked for so many people because he took these concepts we'd heard about in fairy tales, with elves and trolls and whatever, and made something from them. Those fantasy stories, which have broken out since then, understood that core concept. That fantasy is one of the best ways to get a new perspective on our own world through the lens of our cultural memories, and that's the kind of world that succeeds. I mean, even Game of Thrones is basically ripping off the War of the Roses from real life, but I could not mean ripping off in a more positive way. It's an interesting piece of history. Why not write stories about it? This could lead me into even further topics like the D&Dification of the fantasy genre in general, which might not mean what you think I mean by that I'd love to discuss depending on how this video does. Yet the core point is this. Have your northern barbarians, but give them something more. Write their sagas. Have your medieval knights, but give them a different take on what chivalry really means. Don't leave Neutralia as some non-specific desert kingdom with desert people. Develop it into a rich land informed by your own research into relevant cultures that have survived and thrived in the world's deserts. Here's where I'll bring in my own map, which does have some vaguely European features and all that sort of thing. It's got a desert kingdom to the south, but I suppose I'll leave it up to you to judge whether, at the outset, it stands up against the giant of world-building genius that is the world of Protagnia. In either case, I put it here to say that, while my story takes place in that green monastery near the middle, in an area inspired by the Swiss Alps, that doesn't mean that I haven't taken the time to make that Sonamid Empire in the south into an interesting place. And I'll gladly admit I just stole that name from the Sassanids. You know why? Because the biggest lesson of them all is that none of these people's opinions matter if you're putting effort in and doing what you're doing with a purpose. And if people call that cringe, then just embrace it. One, because we're all talking about people strapping metal sheets to themselves and beating each other with sticks, while some guy in a pointy hat strikes his enemies down with lightning. And two, because you shouldn't let the irony poisoning win. Oh, and the last thing I'll throw in there in regards to my own map that could be worth noting is that I also don't do that thing where the Eastern, vaguely Slavic place is inherently evil. That's something that seems to show up a lot. I only even mention it because that's a whole other topic that really I should cover at some point. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this kind of strange video. If you have any thoughts of your own about my bad takes on the fantasy genre, or you'd like more of them, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way since we're still small here. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all of our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons, Shadowrunner and Sani, Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our Knight, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, it will never not be funny that I really could have just been talking about the Ninjago map this entire time.